Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 45 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. Janir panted, one hand braced against the wall, the other gripping her carcatan. "Do you need to rest for a moment?" Knistrith waited with one hand on her hip, head cocked to the side. "I'm fine," Janir protested, forcing her back straight and following after Knistrith down the limestone corridor. In the days since her awakening, she had become accustomed to Knistrith's presence. She certainly didn't feel the need to run screaming from the woman any longer, even if at times her aunt could be restrictive, such as not allowing her to see her brother Lucan when he had come to her door yesterday. Knistrith had still not given a good explanation for that. "It's not a race. The gardens will still be there when we arrive. Slow down, Janir." The last sentence fell with the sharp heaviness of an order. Janir was supposed to learn her first drills with the carcatan today, or rather, relearn the drills she had forgotten. Unlike other skills, such as writing, reading, or even riding, the skill to handle her black rods was lost. Knistrith had non-committally said it might have something to do with being tortured with carcatan. They reached a flat lawn that surrounded the fountain houses on a manicured layer of leafy emerald. Knistrith wouldn't give Janir any instructions until the maiden had caught her breath. Finally, Knistrith was satisfied. "Leave your carcatan at the far end of the lawn, by those jasmine vines, then return here." Janir decided that Knistrith had no intention of giving an explanation, and began striding across the lawn to obey. Several times, Knistrith shouted for Janir to slow down. There wasn't a weirwarg behind her, after all. Janir laid her carcatan at the opposite end of the lawn and returned to take up a position beside Knistrith. She was almost out of breath again, and she was furious with herself for being so fragile. "Summon them," Knistrith said flatly. "I'm sorry?" "Summon them," Knistrith repeated. "How do I—" Did her aunt expect her to call and coax them like two hound pups? "Concentrate." Staring across the lawn to where her carcatan were just a speck of blackness against the lush grass, Janir was clueless. "Reach for them," Knistrith continued. "Command them to come to you, and they will obey." Janir reached for her carcatan far across the lawn. She felt like a fool, there for any passerby to see, arms and fingers grasping at nothing. "Pull them toward you," Knistrith ordered. Janir dropped her arms. "How?" "Concentrate and listen to me," was the other woman's opaque reply. With a sigh, Janir resumed her earlier pose. "Draw them into your hands. Call them across the distance. Focus, or else nothing's going to happen," Knistrith snapped. Suddenly, Janir was aware of her father watching from one of the upper windows overlooking the garden. She couldn't make out the details of his expression, but it was him. Under a new sense of pressure, Janir locked all her attention on the carcatan. Taking a deep breath, Janir focused. She imagined reeling the rods toward her like fish. Janir thought the carcatan moved, just a little. At this distance, it was hard to tell, but she was fairly certain. She tried again. This time, Janir knew the carcatan moved. With a small sense of triumph, she glanced to Knistrith and her father from his overhead perch. Across the lawn, her carcatan flinched. Excited, Janir focused. They flew up and darted toward her outstretched hands. They whirred like arrows and landed directly A sharp sting shot up her arms. Yelping, Janir dropped her rods. She shook her hands, trying to wring out the burn. Knistrith grinned meanly as Janir sputtered curses and gasped in pain. "That was very good, Princess Janir." Knistrith nodded, once Janir had stopped. "You have learned a very valuable lesson." Janir wondered if there was a double meaning to that, but decided against asking. She glanced up to the window where her father had been, but he was gone. "Pick up your carcotton," Knistrith commanded. Janir didn't move and glared at her aunt. "They won't sting you now," Knistrith promised. Apprehensive, Janir stooped and tapped one. It seemed safe, so she hesitantly picked up them both. The familiar feeling of harmony seeped into her, though her bones remained jarred from the impact. Her pride had taken the greatest wound. "All right, now that you have relearned that, we can move on." Knistrith put Janir through a series of painfully simple stances and exercises for the next 2 hours, with frequent breaks, making Janir try again and again at whatever she was doing until she got it perfect. Knistrith would take a position and tell Janir to copy her. And Janir would. But then her aunt would inevitably point out several mistakes Janir was making, no matter how hard Janir had concentrated to get it right. Janir wanted to scream when Knistrith kept on repeating some vague command, such as, "Take a stronger stance." She hated having to ask Knistrith to explain it. It made her feel ignorant. But Knistrith ended up explaining on her own when Janir repeatedly failed. "That's it. We're done," Knistrith spontaneously announced. "Did I get it wrong again?" Janir was ready to cry with frustration. "No, you got it nearly right. I think now's a good time to stop. We may have already overdone it for the first day." Janir brushed several beads of sweat from her brow. Her muscles felt weak and overstretched as she replaced her carcotton in their sheaths, despite what should have been an easy set of exercises. "We'll continue again tomorrow." "Am I being too hard on myself?" Janir asked, wiping her hand on her burgundy tunic. "Being hard on oneself is a highly underrated attribute," Knistrith replied. "But keep in mind that you are still convalescing. Come." Janir followed her aunt to a pavilion of green jade in the shade of a weeping willow, surrounded by hedges with tiny white flowers. Inside was a table set with a midday meal for Janir and Knistrith by 2 servants, a girl and a boy. "How are you making your way through the books I gave you?" Knistrith delicately lowered herself into a wrought iron chair on one side of the table. "I still haven't gotten past the great betrayal," Janir unhappily reported. "When the Argetallams race was still in the service of the Brevian kings. And then the revolt and slaughter." Janir half-heartedly accepted the seasoned fish over rice that the servants dutifully placed in front of her, trying to focus on what she had done wrong in her exercises so she could do better tomorrow. It just made her head hurt again. Clearing her throat, Janir took a sip of her tea. "You said that the entirety of my personal guard was killed." It was an abrupt change of subject, but she had been meaning to ask the question for some time. Knistrith didn't make eye contact. "I'm afraid so." "I don't remember them." "Chetan Shrai often has lingering side effects," Knistrith answered. "Just because you don't remember doesn't mean it will affect you long term." "No, you don't understand. They died for me, and I can't even remember their faces." Knistrith shifted in her seat. "It's not your fault, Janir." "You don't know that." "I don't know that. What if I told them to rest in the wrong copse or take a road they thought was too narrow? What if it was my fault?" Janir shook her head. The thought of those anonymous people had nagged at her since learning what had happened. Now that she was thinking about them, she couldn't seem to stop. Tears came, and Janir scrubbed her eyes while the servants stared in mute shock. They gave their lives, and I can't even tell you their names. They swore an oath to protect you, Janir, Knistrith said cautiously. It's all right. No, how can you say that? Janir cried, slamming her hands against the table. My mother died for me too. Is my life really worth so much? How many guards were with me? How many sons and daughters never came home? Janir couldn't explain why it upset her so much, but there seemed to be some cruel, twisted joke to this entire story. She wavered between rage and grief. Do they mean nothing to you? Knistrith blinked at her. I can't. They didn't deserve. Janir dissolved into tears as Knistrith waved the servants away. The servers scurried off noiselessly, leaving the Argetallams and their odd conversation. It's all right, Knistrith crooned, rising to stand behind Janir and gently massage her shoulders. You always were a tender heart. I'm sorry. Janir wasn't sure why she had yelled at her aunt any more than she was sure why she had been afraid when she had awakened. I am so tired, Janir groaned, hiding her face in her hands, but so restless at the same time. She disliked Knistrith's hands on her shoulders, but didn't feel like she should shove the woman off. How about a walk to calm you then? Knistrith hesitantly suggested. I've memorized the layout of this garden already. I was rather thinking of the city. Knistrith interjected. Actually, how would you like to go riding? Janir's head lifted at that. She had been wanting to see the city again lately, but she couldn't. Colbo's still tired. Who? Colbo, my horse. Ouch! Janir winced as a sharp throb went through her head. Your horse is Cami, Janir, Knistrith corrected, carefully. Janir's brow furrowed in confusion. I could swear his name is Colbo. Cami is a she, Knistrith continued, rubbing Janir's shoulders reassuringly. It will all make sense soon enough. Janir said nothing. I have other tasks to tend for the Lord Argetallum, but I can send one of the honor guard with you. Only one. We don't want people taking notice of you just yet. I think it could easily overwhelm. Knistrith returned to her place across the table from Janir. A little excursion in the streets could do you good. Maybe you'll remember something. Janir didn't think Knistrith had sounded hopeful at that last sentence, but Janir couldn't help entertain the idea. I'll send Morton Cerilius with you. The name sounded familiar. It was a welcome change. Will he be playing babysitter to me? Knistrith let off a chirp of laughter. The honor guard's purpose is to serve the presiding Argetallum and the royal family even unto death. I don't think accompanying Princess Janir through Adasha will be too much a stretch of his loyalty, do you? I want their names. What? Janir cleared her throat, straightening. If they died for me, I want to know their names. Knistrith swallowed. I'll have one of the secretariats gather the list for you. And I want to visit their families. Knistrith hesitated. I have to at least tell them I'm sorry. I survived and their children didn't. You are the crown princess. You are far more important? Janir interrupted, hands fisting in the tablecloth. She shook her head. Janir? A hardness crept into Knistrith's tone. I don't think it would be best. Janir peered up at her aunt quizzically. Why not? Let's just start with the ride today, all right? Morton Cerilius certainly hadn't been selected to be an honor guard for an open and easy nature. He kept almost totally silent, discreetly scouring their surroundings with an austere efficiency. They wound their way through the streets at a leisurely pace, letting other riders and carts of goods pass them along the cobblestoned streets. Janir was aboard a placid mare, while Cerilius rode a prancing liver-chestnut stallion with a white star on its forehead. Either side of the street was lined with the high limestone walls and iron gates that surrounded the private homes of aristocratic Argetallams. Janir studied the front gates, noting that how elaborate the gate's design seemed to be a status declaration of the family that lived behind it. Janir found the feeling of leather reins in her hands to have a familiarity about it, and that gave her a small sense of triumph. Janir glanced sideways to her guard. He was swarthy, like most Argetallams, with a close-shaven beard. He had a confident, calm bearing that made Janir instantly think of him as a brave, if not a great, warrior. Over his left eye he had a pale, puckered scar that Janir thought too untidy to have been left by a blade. And she had the most frustrating feeling that she should know how he had gotten it. Cerilius met her gaze, and Janir realized she had been staring. Sorry, she stammered. Cerilius turned back to the street in front of them and said nothing. Will you be going with the Lord Argetallam to Valmachen? Janir had attempted to speak with Cerilius before without success, but she tried again. She wondered if honor guards weren't supposed to talk. Yes, was the Mortaun's terse reply. They rode on in silence for a few moments. A servant with a net full of fish slung over one shoulder hurriedly crossed their path and vanished into the servant's entrance of his master's estate. Janir found the courage to voice the question she had been wanting to ask since Knistrith had briefly introduced them. Did you know me before I, forgot? Briefly, Cerilius shortly answered. What was I like? Quieter. Janir looked away, humbled. She was his superior in rank and could put him in his place, but she didn't want to do that. Forgive me, Cerilius amended. May I speak freely, Princess Janir? Janir thought he already had, but nodded and braced herself. We met only shortly before your misfortune, but in that time I saw that you have a great deal of courage and persistence, even if your lack of experience often showed, and you more often than not misapplied your virtues. That was the longest phrase Cerilius had spoken since Knistrith had introduced them just over an hour before. Janir sheepishly responded, staring down at her hands. Well, I value your truthfulness. She twisted the leather reins in her fingers. Not a lot, but Yes, Cerilius shortly replied. Janir wondered if she had done anything to upset Cerilius before her misfortune. He certainly acted like it. Meanwhile, the only time Janir remembered anything was a few rare occasions when she would recall something from her childhood, like when her mother had taken her to visit the marketplace and its motley of colors, accompanied by about a dozen gruff guards, who had hung over them like storm clouds. Slavish traders and plebeians, free men and free women who weren't Argetallams, mingled with their overlords, though everyone still gave Argetallams a wide berth. The market was alive with the scent of spices and the vibrant silks from Slavin. Janir stopped at the sight of the slave market. Dozens of Brevians, Slavish and Tathansians alike, chained together near the docks. She stared as a young man was dragged onto the stage and the auctioneer started the bidding. He was boasted as a strong, healthy worker with skills as a blacksmith. The small crowd at their feet began to call out bids. Milady? Cerilius addressed her without prompting for the first time. Come, milady. He carefully guided her away, but made no more mention of it. When the evening bells clanged from the lookout posts to announce that the sun had just touched the northwestern horizon, Janir and Cerilius turned their steeds back in the direction of the stables in silence. Knistrith was waiting for them, and she whisked Janir away, saying that she needed to get ready for dinner. The Lord Argetallum wanted her to dine with the rest of the royal family. Knistrith selected a gown of cream-colored damask, and Janir put it on without complaint, even if she found it oppressively tight. Her aunt called a handmaiden and had the girl braid Janir's hair into a knot. Knistrith said that since it was only the family, jewels weren't necessary. Janir covertly felt a twinge of disappointment. She secretly coveted the idea of wearing just one of the luxurious baubles in her closet. When the handmaiden finished and Janir was brought out of the wardrobe for inspection, Knistrith smiled, like a court painter fawning over his masterpiece. You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.